I'd like to welcome you all to the 2013 University of Chicago Summer Teacher Institute. This year's theme is Natural Disasters and Social Responses, a Global Perspective. My name is Andy Grahn. I am the new Assistant Director for Programs at the University of Chicago's International Studies and one of the organizers of this event, and it's my honor and privilege to welcome you all today. I'm new to the University of Chicago Center for International Studies beginning only 2 months ago, but it's been a real thrill to join my partners at the University of Chicago area centers and finalizing the program for today. We have an exciting 3 days of engaging speakers and I'm sure engaged discussion that will emerge from all of the presentations. And I look forward not only to listening but also participating. I come from the University of Virginia where I was teaching in the anthropology department there. Formerly, I had worked at the University of Chicago Center for East European and Russian Eurasian Studies at the Outreach Coordinator. And so I feel like most of us around the room today, I wear at once a scholar hat and a teacher hat. I'm always excited to be confronted with new ideas, to engage them, and to think about how to teach them. And I really look forward to participating with you all in conversations, not only in regard to natural disasters and thinking about the human factors that can contribute to natural disasters, but also thinking about how we can teach this material to students at a myriad grade levels and even in across disciplines, across course subjects, so on and so forth. And so each day we'll have on one day, 5 speakers. There will always be ample time for questions and answers afterwards. And on each day, we will also have time dedicated for us to break into groups around tables and to think about how we can translate some of the material presented and discussed during the day into lesson plans, into curriculum for our own classrooms. Through this, you all will have many opportunities to work with one another, to meet one another, and also to interact with and network with our supporting staff here at the University of Chicago. In the remainder of my time, I'm going to truncate my remarks in lieu of keeping on with the intention of keeping on schedule. But I want to cover a few housekeeping items so that our days will go smoothly, and then introduce some of our co-sponsors who were integral, essential in bringing this year's edition of the Summer Teacher Institute to realization. So housekeeping items. First of all, we will have 2 breaks today, one at 10:30 a.m., the other at 3 p.m. During these times, of course, check cell phone messages, text messages. There's water always out in the lobby here on the 3rd floor. In addition, there is a men's room on the 3rd floor, this floor, just outside these doors and to the left. The women's room is 1 floor down on the 2nd floor, again towards the west side of the building. We will also have lunch served between 12 p.m. and 1 p.m. And during that time, we will have outreach coordinators and representatives of our sponsoring organizations sitting at the tables down in the 1st floor commons room who will be happy to speak with you all about the outreach programs that their centers and institutions sponsor. And it will also be a great chance just for us all to meet one another. We will be spending 3 days. It will be a great opportunity just to exchange information about ourselves, our own teaching interests, our own intellectual interests, so on and so forth. And then finally, just one overarching announcement. Unfortunately, with the exception of iced water or water in general, there is no food or drink allowed in this room. It's not our rule, it's the building rule. The folks who manage this facility really like the carpet, and so they want to keep it clean. So be it. But there will be refreshments down on the 1st floor in the commons room. As I mentioned, lunch will be provided, and each morning we will have a light breakfast available for you all as well. One final housekeeping note. You may have noticed that this room is not air-conditioned. So maybe, well, we'll say perhaps it was by luck, perhaps it was by design. This will contribute to the sensorial experience of perhaps what some of you might experience as a natural disaster. Hopefully it won't get too bad. We do have fans, but as is the case with many buildings at the University of Chicago, this is an old one, but we do welcome you to enjoy ice water and as plentifully as you may be able to do. And there is a chance, hopefully a slim chance is what I've been told by the directors of the building, but some construction may be taking place on the very front around the entryway of this building. Hopefully it won't disturb us, but if so, recognize it's not an earthquake, it's not a tsunami, but rather just some renovation occurring to the front of the building, but hopefully it will not impede our own progress on this day. Without further ado, I would now like to take the time to introduce and thank the organizations that have worked with the Center for International Studies to make possible this 2013 Summer Teacher Institute, as well as to introduce the representatives, outreach coordinators of these institutes who've been so important in contributing their ideas, their labor, their insight, their passion in making today possible. First, beginning alphabetically, I would like to thank the Center for East Asian Studies and their Associate Director for Japan, Sarah Earhart, who's over here. If any of you are interested, especially in East Asia, Sarah is a tremendous resource. She will also be leading a lunchtime discussion, a breakout session to talk about the Fukushima nuclear disaster and teaching it in the classroom on our final day, Thursday. I encourage you all to take advantage of Sarah and her expertise. We also would like to thank the Center for Latin American Studies, where Ireri Rivas works as outreach coordinator. Center for Latin American Studies. Then the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, represented here by outreach coordinator Alex Barna. And I would like to express a special personal token of gratitude to Alex, who's been really fantastic in helping me with some of the final planning for this particular day. Alex has really been tremendous. Then we also have the Smart Museum of Art at the University sponsoring today's event, and Lisa Davis, their outreach coordinator, has joined us for today. Then the Southern Asia at Chicago, the South Asia Language and Area Center, is also an important sponsor, and we have Toby Tyker here representing the Institute, the center. And then in addition, we have the Center for East European and Russian and Eurasian Studies. Their outreach coordinator, Dana Immertra, will be here later. There is also the Oriental Institute, which will be represented by Carol Ng. And I'm happy to say that at the conclusion of today's event, there will be guided tours of the Oriental Museum's Institute available to all participants. They've arranged docents to lead those of you who are interested in attending to enjoy their really excellent collection of Egyptian, Assyrian, and Sumerian artifacts. And then we also are proud to have as co-sponsors the program on the global environment, as well as the University of Chicago's Center for Global Health. And so, without further ado, I would now like to introduce our first speaker, Mark Lycett, who will be speaking on naturalizing disaster, nature, vulnerability, and social history. And just a few words about Mark. Dr. Lycett is currently the interim director of the Center for International Studies here at the University of Chicago, and he has directed the university's program on the global environment since its launch in 2007. His current interests focus on the historical anthropology and social ecology of colonial landscape formation in Latin America, Western North America, and South Asia. And he holds a PhD from the University of New Mexico. And Dr. Lycett will be offering us some opening remarks and framing questions for the proceedings to follow in the 2013 Summer Teacher Institute. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andy. All right. To natural disasters and social response as a global perspective. Now, my own contribution to this particular institute is entitled Naturalizing Disaster, Nature, Vulnerability, and Social History. Good title. It was also the name of our spring speakers series in CIS and PGE this year, which was a three-part interdisciplinary lecture series examining conceptions of hazard, policies and practices for managing disaster, and questions of justice in the dynamic between nature, dislocation, and communities in what is an increasingly vulnerable world. As it happens, this is also the title of a seminar I taught at the same time with my colleague Phil Drake. Phil is an expert in the cultural conception and representation of disaster in Southeast Asia. It's a shame he couldn't be here today. But we were very, very lucky to hear from some of the very best scholars and experienced practitioners in the conception, the management, and the understanding of disasters. And you'll hear from some of those same people today. Kathleen Tierney will be speaking to you next, one of the people we were very lucky to hear from. And I learned an enormous amount from our speakers, from our students, and from the diverse body of scholarship on these topics. Unlike Phil, I'm not an expert in disaster studies per se. Instead, as Andy told you, I'm an historical anthropologist. I study the social ecology of colonial landscape formation in places like South Asia, in places like Latin America, in the Spanish colonial parts of the American West. Right? So for me, emergent conditions, disasters we might call them, displacement, famine, mortality crises, these are all part of the story that I'm trying to tell. And the stakes of that story are enormous. They're enormous for historical understanding, for contemporary policy, and I think also for pedagogy. And I'll get to that in a minute. Okay. So I'm going to take as my task today to relay some of the things I've learned in the past couple of months, and particularly some of the things that I've learned about the complex issues that arise in framing disaster as both a theoretical and a practical problem. I'll share a formal definition with you in a minute, but first I want to briefly discuss the stakes of how we define these terms. Okay? Now, before you even came in here, probably before you even signed up for this summer institute, you had a sense of what a disaster was. Right? You probably had a sense of what a natural disaster was. We all walk around with an idea about and a common sense understanding of natural disaster. And many of us have personal experience of disaster. In a 2-year period, I experienced an earthquake, a wildfire, and a hurricane, right? So I have a personal stake. I have a rooting interest in these terms. Names like Katrina, Sandy, Mitch, and if you work in South or Southeast Asia, the tsunami, right? These are all immediately evocative. Right? Places like Darfur, Somalia, Ethiopia, Bangladesh, and Haiti arguably symbolize crisis as much as they do anything else. Right? From an historical perspective, famines haunt the memory of Ireland and Bengal and China. Right? And if we extend our understanding of natural a little bit, as I'll invite you to do, Bhopal, Chernobyl, Fukushima, Hiroshima, all of these are unmistakable markers of environmental, social, and political crisis. Just now, widespread drought in North America is contributing to lowered water levels in the Great Lakes crop losses in the Midwest, right? And an emergent cycle of wildfire and forest loss throughout the western United States. Right? At the same time, rising sea levels, extreme weather events threaten coastal settlements, displace new waves of climate migrants, and perhaps even more importantly, right, permanently change the ecology of some of the world's most productive agricultural zones. And I'm thinking especially here of the great deltas and floodplains of Asia. Clearly, the stakes of understanding variability in emergent crises are really, really high. And they're really, really present. And if anything, they're growing. Okay? All right. But I want to step back from those events, for a second, and consider the pedagogical stakes of natural disaster. Okay? In human terms, we can talk about disaster as a process, as an event, as a personal experience, as history, and as a symbol, all at the same time. Now, for me, as director of an interdisciplinary environmental studies program, right, this is a good thing. Right? I seek out topics that cross disciplinary lines, that require natural scientists and policy expertise, right, that can be considered from historical and contemporary perspectives, right, that raise issues in law, in ethics, in economics, in politics, in science, all at the same time. And disaster is certainly one of these kinds of topics. Historians, anthropologists, sociologists, political scientists, and economists can all converge with geophysicists, with biologists, with medical researchers, as well as ethicists, literary and cultural theorists, human rights experts, right? All together are needed to speak on these issues, right? Can all be in the same room talking about these issues. So the literatures are broad and diverse, and the points of engagement are many. Right? Climate change, biodiversity threats, sustainable development, conservation, environmental justice, human rights, all of these topics are entailed in disaster studies. History, technology, climate science, political theory, also all part of the picture. Right? So there's a lot to work on, and there are many ways to work on it. Right? If, as I think, we must understand disaster to be a socio-natural process rather than a simple combination of nature and bad timing, right, then it becomes a kind of unifying topic for a broad range of studies and a broad range of approaches. So I want to begin a little bit by framing the problem. Right? And I'll begin with the UN ISDR definition. I guess it's as good as any. The United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction defines disaster in three crucial terms, and I've helpfully highlighted them for you: hazards, vulnerability, and capacity. Okay. I've often thought of this as a kind of epidemiological approach to disaster studies. Right? It defines what the problem is, who's vulnerable to it, and perhaps how it might be mitigated. Okay. While only the first of these terms, right, can be natural in the way that we commonly understand what natural means, catastrophic events and processes are frequently represented, both in popular and technical sources, as part of a natural world that's outside of social control. Exogenous, autonomous, unpredictable elements of the biophysical world, the tsunami that comes from nowhere, the earthquake that you couldn't predict, the volcanic eruption that you weren't ready for. And we'll talk about the theorization of disaster as a property of nature in a moment, but I also want to emphasize that drought, flood, earthquake, excuse me, and famine all have historical, economic, and cultural contexts as well as biophysical ones. Right? And that we should understand both vulnerability and capacity as outcomes of socio-natural histories and relations. Right? Or as I and some of my colleagues might put it, they have a political and a historical ecology as well as a natural ecology. Okay. So looking again at this definition, right, we might note that it can be criticized in a number of ways. It's certainly vague, right? It's general enough to cover absolutely everything. And in fact, it's even in parts quite circular. Okay? But it does cover a lot of ground. And it focuses our attention not merely on proximate causes, right? Not merely on the drought or the earthquake, but on the conditions that convert those proximate causes, right, or hazards, from something which is solely natural to something that's a human crisis. It also emphasizes some other things, right? And I have added this sort of yellow emphasis right here to point that out. This definition turns on governance and technical capacity to cope with catastrophe. Right? Governance is an important term and one that we'll come back to. But for now, what I want to point out is that the governance that it imagines is an external one. Right? International, perhaps, humanitarian, defined by technical and administrative competence, and very much removed from the exigencies of local or internal politics. Exactly what might be needed, then, to mitigate the effects of an immediate emergency that's outside of the capacity of the local, but not necessarily what might be needed to address the conditions of vulnerability, something, again, we'll return to. Let's turn to the three elements of the definition in more detail, or I will. But first, let's do that. The first crucial element is to decouple proximate cause and vulnerability. Right? And that's, in effect, what this notion of hazard does. Right? There's a widespread recognition in contemporary studies that hazards are only one condition of a crisis. Right? And that outcomes are related to the circumstances, or only partially related to the circumstances under which a hazard occurs. Right? Given similar external stimuli, we see different outcomes in terms of damage, in terms of mortality, in terms of impoverishment. Right? This is where vulnerability and capacity enter into the equation. Right? So, for example, in Amartya Sen's influential formulation of famine, it's not the absolute lack of resources or lack of food, right, that's the problem, but a lack of access to resources through what he calls entitlement relations, or the dimensions of the individual economy, right, that give you some control over food and other kinds of vital resources. So let's look at vulnerability. We can't possibly understand those outside those things, right, those forms of access to resources, without understanding what it is that mediates access to resources, without understanding the political situation, the social situation, the economic situations that create and reproduce the differential distribution of resources and differential access to resources in the first place, the things that allow a community to prevent, to mitigate, to adapt to changing conditions or emergent circumstances. In these terms, vulnerability always has a political ecology, right? Or a complex set of circumstances mediated by institutions, mediated by power relations, as well as by environmental conditions, right? And something that I hope we'll explore a little bit, right, through the relationship of drought to famine, in that reading that I asked Andy to send out to all of you. Yes, I'm the guy who gave you homework, although I don't necessarily expect that you've all read it. But we can look at that a little bit by talking about the relationship of drought to famine in the 19th century in Mike Davis's late Victorian Holocausts. Okay. All right. And again, the definition of hazard, of vulnerability, of capacity. All of these quite general, all of these quite in line with that initial definition of disaster that we looked at a few minutes ago. Now, defining disaster is the first part, right, of setting a kind of framework for what you'll be talking about over the next 3 days. Another part of it is to define the term natural, right, in a little more detail. Okay. There are two distinct, if related, senses in which natural is used in relation to catastrophic situations. And the first of these is the way that I've pretty much been using it so far, right? As an external biophysical condition unrelated to human agency. The earthquake, the tsunami, the volcanic eruption, the thing which you could not have expected, which destroys or endangers or imperils the conditions of life. Okay? But the second set of natural is one that's really important to understanding the historical conception of disasters, of famine particularly. Okay? The second is a relationship that's underlain or determined by natural law. A relationship rather than an event that's outside of social or political control, or worse, that is only made more dire by attempts to intervene, right? And this is what I'll refer to as, or where what I'll refer to as the Malthusian Consensus becomes relevant. Okay? Everybody's heard of Malthus, right? Okay. Anybody read an essay on population? Right. So you probably have learned a lot more about the Corn Laws, right, than you had ever expected to know if you've read that. And we'll talk about Malthus again in a minute, but this is the basic kind of Malthusian relationship right here. And we'll talk about the Reverend Malthus in a minute, but I want to explain what I mean by the Malthusian Consensus, because it's more than Malthus. Right? By that, I mean the operational understanding and practices of 19th century colonial administrators, particularly in the British colonial world. It's not strictly uniform. It goes back and forth. There are other elements to it, right? But it's certainly inflected with a set of presuppositions that naturalize poverty, that naturalize unequal distributions of risk, that naturalize mortality crises, that naturalize disaster as an outcome of immutable scientific laws. Okay. I think this gives us some insight in how theory, and especially administrative practices, can recreate a very human difference as a natural one. And I think this question is crucial to policy decisions and outcomes because, after all, if inequalities and vulnerability are a property of nature, then they may be tragic, but they're outside of our control. It's also a way of approaching a problem that simplifies complex circumstances by reducing them to nature, right? So we can ignore many of those circumstances because, after all, it's a natural relationship. Now, the Reverend Thomas Malthus, who also held a chair in political economy later in his career at essentially the university that trained colonial administrators, right? So there's a very direct line to British colonial administration and Malthusian concepts. As one of his biographers put it, right, his work is a work of demography, it's a work of economy, it's a work of politics, it's a work of sociology, and especially it's also the work of a public moralist. Right? Now, the basic Malthusian relationship, right, you're all familiar, at least in some senses, with it, even if you haven't read the formal work or some of the mathematical works, is that food increases arithmetically, right, 1 unit at a time. And that's based on the notion that to increase the food base, you have to increase the land base. And as you add 1 unit of land, you get 1 more unit of food, and it just sort of goes up in this linear fashion, right? Population, on the other hand, increases geometrically, right, or exponentially. And that's how we get this kind of curve right here. Right, so where we run into the problem in a Malthusian conception is right in this spot, right, where the population begins to exceed the food supply under a particular kind of regime of food production. Now, I don't want to talk about the methodological adequacy of Malthus today. I don't want to talk about the empirical adequacy of Malthus today, but I do want to talk about some of the ways in which this has inflected our historical understanding of famine, particularly, but also other kinds of disasters. Now, as I've said, right, so in the Malthusian relationship, it's a relationship between these two things, population and resources. And we can think of population as a way of quantifying the demand on resources. Okay. All right. But Malthus was also very much not just interested in demography or even agriculture, but he was also interested in the moral position, right, of society. Right? And one of his big concerns was protecting affluence from this relationship. So affluence stands outside of this relationship, but needs to be protected from it. And particularly, he was concerned that the working class of the emerging working class of England would be drawn into poverty, right, by overpopulation. That the improvident poor would bring down the wealth of the nation, would bring down the industrious poor. Okay. Now, we can really see affluence as another term that greatly affects consumption or greatly affects demand on resources. Right? And it's an important one, and one that is at the center of environmental debates today on a global basis, and particularly some of the differences between the environmentalism of the global south or the developing world, right, and the environmentalism of the north or the global north or the industrialized world. It's a big issue, and it centers on these two kinds of things. The environmental imperative, which we can term that sustainability for now, and the social imperative, which is justice, right, which is based on a notion of environmental rights. This is very much a present concern for environmental movements in most of the world today. Okay, now that's kind of an aside. Okay, so Malthus's essay on population is very much a treatise on moral order as much as it is anything else, and especially about the moral hazard, to use a contemporary term, the moral hazard of charity. Right? Charity to the poor, specifically in the form of the Corn Laws, is simply a way of making the problem worse, right? Because you've always got this immutable relationship between population and resources, and by encouraging people, right, through feeding them, you're just encouraging the problem to get worse. You're not solving the problem. Now, for Malthus, there are a whole series of checks that he talks about. Positive checks, which are things, they're not positive in the sense of being good, they're positive in the sense of being empirical. Right? Things like war, things like disease, and especially things like famine, right? Mortality crises that reduce the population. There are also a whole series of preventative checks, things like delaying the age at marriage, things that interrupt fertility, things that lower the rate of population growth. And those are the ones that Malthus especially focused on. Right? But there are a couple of elements of this, right, that arise in this kind of Malthusian consensus that develops for colonial administrators. It's not just Malthus. Certainly there's some reading of Adam Smith in there. There's some concern with the natural behavior of markets. That's an element of this. There's some other kinds of things that add to it. But it's got some interesting sets of properties that follow from Malthus's work. First, poverty is the inevitable or natural outcome of population growth in a finite space. If populations keep growing and you can't increase production, then immiseration or poverty or eventually starvation will be the result. Right? And the biggest source then of poverty is improvident fertility. It's people having children that they shouldn't wisely have. Right? It's important here that the food supply is something that's mediated naturally rather than socially. It's part of the natural world. Now, one of the interesting things about Malthus, right, about this conception, is that improvidence, then, is a property of classes of people. It's a property of the poor who are not the working poor, or who are below that level of the working poor in the ways in which it's talked about in England. But in the colonial world, it becomes a property of native peoples. It becomes tied into a colonial conception of race as well as class. Right? And that's an important element. That poverty, essentially, is an essential part of the being of colonized people. They're simply poor, improvident, childlike people subject to famine in many kinds of cases. Right? And this leads to a kind or set of policies, right, that are about maintaining the moral order of the colonial situation, about maintaining the integrity of the market, maintaining the integrity of property rather than social welfare necessarily. So that charity, and in often cases, intervention at all in crisis, in famine, in a variety of kinds of things, is seen as a moral hazard, as seen as something which can only make the situation worse. Now, part of what arises from that, right, is that since the market operates on natural principles, since the state can't affect natural principles, that neither the market nor the state are discussed as relevant to the situation or as culpable moral agents in this kind of situation. And this very much has a direct effect, right, on administrators in India, especially company administrators, and then other kinds of colonial administrators throughout the world. Right? And this is exactly the historical moment that Davis takes up in late Victorian holocausts. Okay? So I want to turn to that. I want to turn to this question of, as Davis puts it, turning drought to famine, right? To the political ecology of vulnerability, how it is that we go from a hazard, right, to a widespread kind of crisis. Right? Okay. In Davis's account, The interplay of drought, famine, and poverty is a case study in historical and processual complexity. Right? And by historical, I mean that the proximate causes of disaster are underlain, right, by cumulative conditions, by contingencies, by relationships that limit capacity and create differential vulnerability. Right? By processual, I mean that disaster is just one moment in those long-term historical creations of vulnerability, right? So in this sense, famine isn't just restricted to a period of food shortage, but instead it extends to all of the kinds of precursors and structural conditions that create vulnerability to famine to begin with. Right? So the famine starts long before anyone starts starving or experiences a food shortage. It starts with the vulnerability itself. Now, Davis's main thesis in the book as a whole is that the third world as we know it is a product of inequalities that were created at the intersection of climate and colonial economies at the end of the 19th century, and particularly the ENSO-related droughts of the 1870s, ENSO being El Nino Southern Oscillation, right? Those kinds of changes in ocean currents and temperatures that affect droughts and weather patterns on a worldwide basis. Okay? This is a deliberately provocative and controversial thesis, and I don't think we need to take it up entirely to see the usefulness, right, of this kind of movement, this movement from drought to famine. Now, I've been talking about disaster, and I've been extending the definition of it and making it kind of fuzzy at the boundaries, fuzzy at the edges, right? So you would think that drought, finally, here's something we can measure. Here's something we can know. Here's something that's a simple, straightforward question. Is there a drought or isn't there a drought? Well, sort of. As Davis and many others point out, including natural scientists who work on this topic, drought is really an admixture of forces. Only some of them are natural. Briefly, rainfall variability becomes an issue in the context of specific regimes of land use and domestic water consumption, especially intensive agriculture. And even then, how variation of rainfall turns into a human crisis is a really, really complex, context-specific kind of thing. It's especially influenced by the conditions of vulnerability that often place market-based agriculture at a disadvantage to traditional or non-industrial forms of agriculture, particularly in terms of coping mechanisms for dealing with drought. Now, all of this is not to say that climate variation hasn't produced famines and other crises outside of the context of colonial and post-colonial states. That's not what Davis is claiming. It's certainly not what I'm claiming. But there's good reason to believe that incorporation into broader economies and into colonial states itself produces risk, itself produces vulnerability, right? And it itself produces what Davis refers to as the conditions of ecological poverty. Okay. And he goes through this in the comparison, in the reading I gave you, in the comparison between 19th century India and 19th century China. And that's well worth a look. To see how he draws these out in greater detail. And I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but I just want to hit a couple of high points. As smallholders, or what we used to call peasants, right, are incorporated into commodity markets, into new monetary systems, into new forms of taxation, right, it affects their ability to produce, and it affects their ability to produce at a subsistence level. Their production is being drawn off in new ways, in ways that they have very little control over. right? And this puts them in a situation of chronic indebtedness, typically, chronic indebtedness to a monetary economy that they only have partial access to, partial control over. And it tends to cut down their access to land as a resource, often water as a resource, often other kinds of elements of agricultural production. Right? There's a loss of all kinds of employment opportunities, of resource, of land, of forms of production, as traditional forms, right, of production, of crisis management, of redistribution, get increasingly taken over or drawn off from into the colonial state as agrarian restructuring, particularly a new emphasis on cash crops, because people often have to grow cash crops in order to pay their taxes instead of growing things they can eat, as new irrigation schemes change the very conditions of life. Right? As there is a loss of common resources, or what's often called enclosure in the literature after the British enclosure movement, the 18th century, as new land tenure and new resource access arrangements come into place that cut people off from their traditional resources. Right? This is a really, really vulnerable position to be in. Right? And to use a trivial kind of example, right? If Andy were to abscond with lunch today, right, would all of you have a plan B for how you would feed yourself this afternoon? Right? Of course you would, right? You have ATM cards, you have credit cards, you have resources, you probably have cash in your pocket. You can walk downstairs in this building and there's a cafe, and there's a cafe across the street, right? But if you didn't have those things, if you had no access to those things, if access to ATM cards were mediated by the state and you couldn't, from your position, get one, right? If there were an army between you and the nearest cafe and you couldn't cross over to get it, you would be in a much, much more vulnerable position, right? We all have ways of coping. We all have capacities that, under certain kinds of circumstances, might be cut off. And that's exactly what Davis is talking about. So in this account, lack of effective access to resources, lack of household wealth, and lack of state capacity, or in many cases state interest, in changing these conditions creates a new and very pernicious geography of risk in the world. Right? So we should recognize the distribution of vulnerability as a structural condition of one's place in the market, one's place in the state, one's place in society, every bit as much as one's place in a natural environment. Right? So, as an example, I think it's pretty easy to see how if vulnerability is increased and capacity is stunted, that drought or flood or other kinds of climatic downturns can morph into a crisis. Right? It should also be clear that any hazard, whatever its origin, is more likely to result in widespread crisis under these circumstances. Right? And that the map of vulnerability isn't necessarily the map of climatic variation, right? But it's a map of something else. It's a map of poverty, a map of inequality, a map of political incapacity. In the case of nuclear disasters or industrial accidents, it also might be a map of hubris and mismanagement of technological and natural resources. But in either case, it's the management of capacity and the mitigation of vulnerability that comes into focus as the best target for intervention. Right? And intervention is a question of how disaster is to be governed. So we're going to return to that. I'm going to take the last part of what I'll talk about, and we'll return to that notion of governance. Right? Governance is one of those terms that first arises in the development literature as a way of framing politically sensitive issues quite narrowly, right? As administrative and legal questions, right? Rather than questions of local politics. But it's come to mean much more than that. It's come to refer broadly to control or management through a range of local, national, and international institutions and bodies, and even informal kinds of associations like civil society or community stakeholders. So we can talk about non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and their role in governance. We can talk about local communities and local stakeholders just as easily as we can talk about the state or the federal government and their role in governance. It's a really broad topic. It entails important questions about sovereignty, about agency, about expertise and who has it, and also about power and about development and how each of these things can be defined and for whom. And I'm barely going to scratch the surface of any of that. Here I just want to raise a few discussion questions. Oh, that's interesting. And focus on three issues. First, where or where should intervention be located? Where is or should capacity be found? And finally, how do human rights and environmental justice-based approaches reflect on shared global responsibilities? Okay. If reducing vulnerability and enabling capacity is the long-term goal of disaster governance, mitigation of the effects of humanitarian crisis is very often the short-term reality of intervention. And of course, if you're an NGO, if you're a charity, it's easier to raise money and awareness and to mobilize constituencies around tragic events than around infrastructure schemes and poverty alleviation measures that may take generations to implement. It's often absolutely necessary, of course, to prevent further loss, to save lives, to rescue communities from dire circumstances. Right? But there may be some inadvertent negative effects. Right? For example, in his book, Famine Crimes, Alex DeWall develops an extended and a quite detailed and sensitive discussion of the ways in which international humanitarian and development organizations can displace local political responsibility, can decrease accountability, can often quite inadvertently diminish local capacity. Right? And more recent and more vocal critiques of neoliberal development and aid projects, right, ask whether these policies simply enhance vulnerability through the extension of privatization of common resources, through the globalization of labor, of land, and of commodity markets, and generally increase existing inequalities. Right? I'm sure you'll be hearing more of this kind of discussion of development policies throughout the next 3 days. Researchers are questioning how vulnerability is produced and how it's reproduced by intervention or by the lack of intervention, right, in many cases. How capabilities and capacities are best governed, for whom, by whom, and how geographies of risk emerge and how those geographies change and how they might change. Right? Now, we're not going to enter into those debates in any real sense, right? But we can see that a whole series of questions about the relationship between states, about political autonomy and its responsibilities, about global economies, about the effects of international development and aid policies, are taking place around the governance of disaster. It's an important topic in many of these kinds of big debates. These are big questions. They should certainly remain part of our public dialogue when considering our place in the world and when considering our responsibility to the world. Okay. And they certainly go towards the issue of capacity, especially the question of where it should reside. A better question, I think, might be how it should be partitioned among various levels and forms of agency. Right? But what is the role and responsibility of national or global powers and of local communities in disaster management? Right? If we're not addressing local capabilities, if we're not enabling political institutions capable of accountability and capacity building, right, then how can we expect to change that map of vulnerability that's developed over the last couple of hundred years? Right? Finally, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't raise a few questions of equity and rights-based approaches to environmental justice, and that goes back to that graph of the relationship between population resources and affluence that we talked about earlier, and the notion of environmental rights as being, and rights to reduce vulnerability in some sense, as being central. Okay? These certainly aren't unique to disaster studies, but they are certainly a way of approaching the problem of vulnerability. For example, is food security a right? Do people have a right to an adequate food supply? Do people have a right to food sovereignty or control over their own food supply? There are many people in the world right now who are arguing yes, who see this as central. Right? In South Asia, there is now a law guaranteeing food security as a right, for example. Who or what is responsible for mitigating the effects of global change, of global climate shifts in particular, of sea level changes, right? Of storm damage? Right? If global climate change derives in part, or in large part, from the industrial history of the West, are we also responsible, right, for helping to mitigate the effects of that change? Right? This is certainly something that is a sticking point, to put it mildly, in climate negotiations, this question of the relationship between justice and sustainability that we talked about a little bit earlier. Right? What then is the relationship between equity or justice and affluence, and our ability, or the, let's say, the empirical fact that we consume a lot more resources, and especially a lot more energy resources per capita than do people in the global south, than do people in the developing world. Right? What follows from that? What responsibility might we have based on that? Again, these are extraordinarily broad questions, and these are questions without easy resolutions. Right? I think, however, that they direct our attention to crisis as a process rather than as an event, and to the social, ethical, and political dimensions of disaster as a socio-natural phenomenon. Thanks.
Okay, we now have 15 minutes or so for Q&A. I'll be roaming around the room to give the mic to people who would like to ask questions.
Anyway, this right to food security is such a fascinating development in Asia. Where do you see that going? I mean,
first of all, it's fraught with enormous kinds of practical issues, right? You can make a law that says everybody has a right to an adequate supply of food. But how do you get everybody an adequate supply of food, right? Because it's mediated by all of those kinds of things that we talked about, by the market, by various forms of governance, by sets of household resources. by the fact that everybody isn't exactly alike in how they go about getting their food, right? Or they go about getting an adequate supply of food. So it'll be very interesting to see how it plays out. But this is an aspirational right that's been central to human rights discourse throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century. It's something that's central to the UN Declaration on Human Rights, for example. The notion that people have a right not to starve to death. Right? But putting that in place is a more difficult question. So I think you'll get to see, in effect, right, how that works if you follow the Indian newspapers.
My question was, you mentioned a guy named Davis. What book, where would I go to study what he said?
So there's a bibliography that I put together, just a brief bibliography that touches on some of these topics, and Andy will be making that available to you either on the resource page or as a handout. I'm not sure which, but the book is called Late Victorian Holocausts, and there's already an online excerpt from the book. It's one chapter of the book plus some contextual information that's on the resource page. And I know that in one of the talks later that in the Institute that some other excerpts from that book are going to be used. So it'll be coming up again.
So food security is obviously a huge issue. What about water security?
Water is a big topic, and water security is, it's a much harder question because of the way that water is apportioned through, even in the United States, right, there isn't a uniform way in which agriculturalists, for example, have rights of access to water. It differs. It differs in the West and the East. It differs depending on historical situations. It differs depending on various forms of treaty law. Right? So water security, right, of course, it's vital for human life. It's as vital as food. Right? But maintaining access to water is also an extremely fraught question, exactly in the same way that food security is, and it's probably more legally complicated.
Early in the presentation, you talked about an increasingly vulnerable world. Why do you feel that vulnerability is increasing?
Well, I think that vulnerability is increasing in part, right, because of conditions like rising sea levels, because of intensifying storm cycles, because of new fire ecologies that are emerging in the western United States, because of the drought, because of that forest loss, right? Because so many of these conditions are happening at once. So the levels of damage, right, the cycles of storm intensity, all these things are on the upswing right now. And that's why I think that at least the probability, right, that we live in an age of disasters, right, at least in some senses, is increasing.
Yes, in the reading, it seemed like the decisions made by late Victorian colonial administrators were decidedly neoliberal. And I was just wondering, this being the University of Chicago, whether anybody this week was going to comment on Chicago school economics and disaster capitalism.
I think you're going to hear a little bit about that, right? Especially with more contemporary kinds of issues, especially in Latin America. And that would be a good time to ask questions about that. And I know you're going to have a presentation about the tsunami and its effects on Sri Lanka. And that'd be a perfect time to ask about neoliberal development policies and their effect on disaster mitigation, because those are two places in which this is a really big topic, and there's a lot of literature on those topics right now. I think, yeah, you can see some commonalities. There are definitely some theoretical differences. in the ways in which a neoliberal approach might be different from a kind of 19th century laissez-faire approach. But if you're the victim of a disaster, those might indeed be academic differences from your perspective. So I think there are going to be lots of opportunities to discuss exactly these kinds of policies going forward over the next couple of days. Neoliberalism is a term that's used to refer to the development of economic theory, really starting in the early 20th century, but really in the second half of the 20th century. And it's liberalism, of course, we tend to use it in a narrow political sense, right, in sort of contemporary discourse, but it actually refers to that grand tradition of political and economic freedom going all the way back to the 17th century or so. And neoliberals see themselves as entering a kind of new age of freedom, and particularly market freedom. So it's an approach that's based in market freedom, that's based in fostering competition, that's based on limiting intervention of any sort. And that's a very, very broad definition, but I think that'll be helpful.
And I might take the prerogative of the fellow holding the microphone to ask a question. One thing that I really took away from Mark's talk is how the history of natural disasters and the way that we talk about them is in part a history of how responsibility is apportioned and the effects of how that responsibility is apportioned. And it had me thinking about how so-called natural disasters are commonly spoken about popularly in the mass media in the United States, for example. And so Hurricane Katrina, at least by my recollection, was at least one natural disaster where the human factors, the governmental factors, the economic factors that contributed to the disaster were very much brought to the fore. So it was commonly said it wasn't the hurricane that doomed New Orleans, it was the flood, and the flood being a consequence of levees that hadn't been maintained, of insufficient investment in infrastructure and communities, so on and so forth. But outside of Katrina, it seems to me that oftentimes this discussion of responsibility beyond the natural or so-called acts of gods is often not on the fore of commentary in the media or popularly. So this is a question perhaps once for Mark, but for anyone in the room as well. If there are examples of other recent natural disasters where you felt the more complex dimensions of the disaster, the political, the economic factors, so on and so forth, were really brought to popular attention. The Gulf oil spill.
I think there, boy, it's a difficult question on a lot of levels. I think Kathleen will be able to speak better to Katrina than I will, certainly. But New Orleans, oh my God, New Orleans. There's a lot of reasons why New Orleans is a vulnerable spot, why it has a kind of geography of vulnerability that it has, why Katrina affected it in the way that it did, and why it entered into our political consciousness in a way that not all disasters do, right? But the conditions of vulnerability, right, are present in other cases as well. There are things that mitigate against talking about disasters in those terms. There are media strategies that tend to emphasize the emergent conditions of victims, right? You don't turn on CNN to see a story about infrastructure development that may prevent a disaster in 20 years, right? But you do see victims of hurricanes, you do see victims of other forms of disaster, often in very dire terms. There are strategies and needs of, especially of non-governmental organizations, that lead them to highlight these elements of emergent conditions. And this is one of the things that DeWall talks about, right? What he refers to as the hard needs of Humanitarian International, or their need to raise money, their need to maintain their status as a kind of international organization that mitigates conditions that are out of control, right? So the charity organizations, the intergovernmental organizations, the media often emphasize those kinds of conditions rather than the kinds of backgrounds of vulnerability and capacity that might go towards mitigating emergencies in the long run. So there are lots of things that work together to create that kind of impression, to kind of hide the social part of the socio-natural production of emergencies and crises.
I would just like to add here, think a very relevant source for just what you're talking about is a 2002 book by Eric Kleinenberg called Heat Wave, A Social Autopsy of Disaster in Chicago, which is about the 1995 Chicago heat wave and the reasons why people died in the heat wave.
Early, I'm not sure if it was a rhetorical question or not, but where does intervention fit in? Would you say, in your opinion, should intervention definitely happen before the problem even happens, or is more likely to happen after the natural disaster?
We know, right, from studies by economists, by sociologists, from all kinds of experts, we know, right, that prevention is cost effective. Right? I think intervention needs to happen at levels of prevention and mitigation of effects and to adaptation to changing conditions. That these are all locations for intervention. But then what do we mean by intervention? Who's intervening? Right? How is capacity being built locally, right, through creating greater political agency locally to help create the conditions of prevention? So how this works gets, again, tied directly into how governance is apportioned, who's responsible, right? But certainly, prevention is crucial, and increasing resources for prevention are going to be a lot more effective in the long run than waiting for the floodwaters to rise and then having to deal with the refugees that are created by those floodwaters. Yeah, I suppose that's an issue, right? But I bet they wish that they had higher storm walls in New York right now. I bet they wish they had a better levee system in New Orleans a few years ago. I bet they wish they had a better tsunami warning system in Indonesia, right, before the tsunami instead of after the tsunami. I'm pretty sure that there's a lot of discussion going on in Japan right now about the adequacy of flood wall preparations for tsunamis. Right? Sure. Well, we do have those discussions in California, right? If you've been to California, if you've lived in California as I have, right, we expect earthquakes, right? We expect earthquakes, and we build buildings so they don't pancake when there's an earthquake. Right, so that we can have a pretty serious trembler and not that much falls down. Right? Not that many people die. And it might be really, really serious. Right? But it's not as serious as the same earthquake would be in Pakistan. It's not as serious as the same earthquake would be in Turkey, right, or in Iran. Right? So, in fact, we do put money into prevention in the United States in very real ways, especially in places like California. If we stop doing that, right, or change the way in which we do that, we might be making ourselves more vulnerable without even realizing it.
Well, I'm afraid that we are out of time for our first speaker. Let's once again thank Dr. Mark Lycett.